My name is Joanna Chikwa. I'm 34 years old, and my 10th wedding anniversary party was supposed to be a moment for my husband, Maverick, and me to raise champagne glasses and accept warm congratulations. But instead, in front of 250 guests, my husband looked me straight in the eye and called me an embarrassment. He said I was just an ordinary doctor, not worthy of sitting at the VIP table, and publicly handed over both that seat and the leadership of a $50 million healthcare foundation to Jessica, his mistress, a venture capital fund manager. I stood frozen, not just because I'd been betrayed, but because I had been humiliated. In my own celebration, all around me were pitiful glances, whispered sarcasm, and then, just as I began to believe I was a failed woman, my quiet, humble father stood up and walked to the microphone, and the entire room fell silent. Before I tell you exactly what he said, tell me where you're watching this video from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, because the truth cannot be hidden. I arrived late to my own 10th wedding anniversary party. Still in my white lab coat, hair hastily tied back, I ran from the operating room to the hotel, barely managing to change into high heels right before entering the lobby. For the past 4 hours, my team and I had been working to save a little girl who had suffered a severe accident. She would have had no chance of survival if her heartbeat hadn't been restored right there on the operating table. But here, in this room bathed in soft crystal lighting and gentle music, no one asked where I had just come from. Not a single flower bore my name on the thank you cards. There were no wedding photos, no family videos. Instead, slides showcased my husband's fundraising achievements. He's the director of a prestigious hospital, and the large-scale medical projects he's been investing in alongside Jessica, a woman always dressed in neutral-toned suits, who stood next to him more than I have over the past 2 years. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. This wasn't a celebration of marriage. It was a gala to solicit funding for the Congenital Heart Defect Children's Fund. Maverick laughed often, speaking with entrepreneurs and donors. Jessica was repeatedly introduced as the most powerful fundraising connector of the year, while I was assigned to table 12, reserved for low-ranking doctors and nurses. When I gently asked the staff about the seating mistake, the woman hesitated, then pointed apologetically to an official list approved by management. Across the room, Maverick beamed. Jessica stood beside him, waving to a major investor from Boston, her grip on the champagne glass firm, as if the party were entirely hers. I felt like a shadow, completely invisible in the life I helped build. But I wasn't the only one who noticed. Charles, my father, sat quietly at a table across from me, eyes glued to his phone. It was a familiar signal only I understood. He was monitoring the situation closely. We had prepared for tonight. Maverick once promised that the leadership role in the foundation would be mine. A pediatric heart surgeon with nearly 15 years in the field, someone who had devoted herself to research in congenital heart surgery. But since Jessica arrived, every promise had turned to dust. I remembered those early years of our marriage, when Maverick had nothing and I had turned down a residency scholarship from Mayo Clinic just to stay and help him build his first private hospital. He once held my hand in our old apartment, bathed in morning light, and said, "I'll never forget what you've sacrificed for me." But today, that promise dissolved into the clinking of glasses and congratulatory toasts aimed at another woman. I walked toward table 12, where a group of young doctors sat speaking quietly, and took a seat. One of them, Lisa, looked at me silently. She was about 26, her eyes bright and grateful. I recognized her immediately. Lisa Wong, a cardiology resident who had once been my patient at age 18 after a serious car crash just before her university entrance exams. That 7-hour surgery had changed the course of her life. She abandoned her dream of becoming a soldier like her father, and instead chose medicine, with a promise to save lives the way you saved mine. She sat there, witnessing me being placed at the very last table on the very day meant to celebrate 10 years of marriage. None of the people speaking on stage knew this, but she knew. I knew. And my father, Charles, knew. And tonight, they will know. The music stopped. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. My husband stepped onto the stage to formal applause, more like a CEO entering a shareholders' meeting than a husband celebrating a marriage. He stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and swept his eyes across the room like a strategist about to announce a major deal. I sat at table 12, nearly 20 meters from the stage, obscured by towering white orchid arrangements that felt more like barricades than decoration. Maverick began with scripted gratitude, thanking donors, medical teams, and Jessica for her resilient and exceptional partnership. My name wasn't mentioned once. He spoke of numbers, over 50 million USD raised in 3 months, plans to expand into neighboring states, and a nationwide vision for the Children's Heart Foundation. Every word seemed meticulously crafted to win over wealthy hearts. I clenched my hands under the table, trying to keep my breathing steady. And then, it happened. Maverick paused, looked toward Jessica in the front row, and smiled with a pride I hadn't seen from him in years. "And now," he said, his voice echoing across the hall, "I'm honored to announce the individual who will officially take on the role of executive director for the Young Hearts Foundation, leading our strategic growth in the coming phase, none other than Jessica Langston." Applause. A long, unified wave of applause, lasting more than 10 seconds. Many people even stood. Jessica rose, walking confidently to the stage, her pale cream suit catching the spotlight above. She took the microphone and began her speech with, "I'm not a doctor, but I believe in data. And data tells us, for every dollar placed in the right hands, we can save a heart." It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. That was a phrase I'd written in my own medical research report, the same line I'd used to open a presentation at an internal medical conference 2 years ago. She used it like it was hers. I turned to Charles. He wasn't looking at me, not at the stage, just at his phone, his fingers tapping in short, decisive beats. I didn't know what he was doing, but in that moment, as the applause carried on, and Jessica's name filled the LED screen behind her, all I felt was emptiness. I had given my youth to medicine. I had turned down countless opportunities to stand by the man I thought would be my anchor. And now, I was the one being erased from the very dream I had helped build. And they, Maverick and Jessica, were basking in that spotlight as if I had never existed. None of the young doctors around me said anything, but Lisa gently placed her hand on mine, without a word. That soft touch was warmer and more valuable than all the applause on that stage. As Jessica stepped down from the stage amidst sustained applause, I remained motionless. A waiter gently placed a glass of wine in front of me, but no one from the event team met my eyes. Not once. I felt like a background character lost in a movie of my own life. The entire ballroom buzzed with chatter. "Jessica's amazing. She's the perfect choice. She manages several venture capital funds. Her connections are incredible." I'd heard this kind of praise before, at medical fundraising events where I was invited to speak, only to have my time cut short so sponsors could promote new products. But this time was different. This time, I was the one being removed from the very stage I helped build. A nearby resident leaned in awkwardly and asked, "Dr. Joanna, I thought you were running the foundation." I smiled. A thin smile, like wind skimming across still water. So did I. I looked around the room, familiar faces from the medical world. Some were colleagues I had interned with. Others were doctors I had assisted in complex heart transplants. But tonight, no one met my gaze. Tonight, they looked toward the stage, where Jessica had just claimed her new title, backed by credentials in professional fundraising and coordinating over $10 million in health tech investments. No one asked if she understood aortic coarctation, fetal echocardiogram diagnostics, or the freezing silence when a tiny heart stops beating on the operating table. None of that had a place on an investment resume. Maverick returned to the stage, continuing his introduction of the board members. Jessica being the only woman among them, highlighted as a symbol of innovation and intelligent financial leadership. Each word he spoke felt like a nail into the already fragile shell that still connected me to him. I wondered, in Maverick's eyes, had I ever truly been a partner, or merely a name he used under Dr. Wife, when showcasing morality and compassion? Charles still sat at the front table. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a move, but I saw his phone light up again and again. He was waiting for the right moment, and I was quietly drifting away from everything I had once believed in, sacrificed for, placed my faith in. On the giant screen above the stage, a slogan scrolled across: Talent drives change. Connection leads the future. Beneath it, an image of Jessica shaking hands with major donors, with Maverick beside her, his hand gently placed on her back, a subtle signal magnified in front of hundreds of eyes. I took a sip of wine, bitter, cold, and utterly unfamiliar. The evening transitioned into the medical team recognition segment, a part that, in the invitation, had been described as honoring those behind the success. I had thought I would be standing next to Maverick at that moment, not for the glory, but for the work. Over the past 6 years, I had coordinated volunteer doctors across 3 states and personally designed free surgical protocols for uninsured children. But when the microphone crackled on, I was still sitting at table 12. Maverick took the mic, wearing his signature composed smile. Every success needs unity, and I want to thank the doctors, nurses, and technicians, the ones who quietly work behind the scenes. He paused and glanced quickly toward my table, especially Joanna, surgeon, and also my wife, who has always been humble, dedicated, and, like so many ordinary doctors, rarely wants to be in the spotlight. Scattered laughter broke out, soft, polite, but to me it shattered like glass underfoot. Ordinary. A word far too small to encompass thousands of nights on emergency shifts, hours-long surgeries that drained the soul, and all the times I declined international conference invitations just to stay and support him. I turned slightly to Lisa, whose eyes burned with doubt and anger, but no one spoke. No one stopped Maverick, because to them, a man calling his wife humble in a ballroom full of light didn't seem wrong. In fact, it even sounded endearing by social standards. Maverick continued, "She doesn't like the spotlight, but I believe everyone has a role. Some connect, some maintain systems, some represent us before donors, and then there are people like Joanna, who keep the heartbeat steady." The applause this time was lighter. Some turned to look at me, nodding as if to say, "You should be proud." But I felt no pride. I felt contraction, compression, and ache, like I was the one lying on the operating table, and no one had administered anesthesia. Meanwhile, Charles received a message. I saw the glow of his phone screen clearly in the dim edge of the table. He read it, then looked up. No expression, no sudden movements. He simply placed his phone on the table and subtly slid a business card toward the man beside him. A stranger to me, dressed in a gray suit, silent since the evening began. They exchanged no words, just one look of acknowledgement. And I knew the plan had begun. Maverick had just diminished me in front of hundreds in the field, but what he didn't realize was that he had also just diminished what he was about to lose. Following Maverick's speech, the LED screen behind the stage transitioned. A short video began to play, narrated by Jessica's calm, steady voice, as if she had rehearsed the script for months. The images showed laughing children in recovery rooms, nurses gently checking patients' heartbeats, hands holding through latex gloves. Then the scene cut to a young black girl being discharged, hugging a teddy bear. Jessica's voice played over soft piano music. A heart may be a biological organ, but it can also be the home of belief. Medicine doesn't just save lives, it reconnects what was once broken. I froze. That sentence, it had once been handwritten in a small brown notebook left behind by my mother. It was a line I had memorized at 15, on the day she passed. My mother was a nurse, and used to write brief, poignant reflections after each night shift. I had treasured that notebook like a relic, carrying it from my med school dorm to my first operating room. Only 3 people had ever read it: myself, Maverick, and once, Jessica, when she visited our home asking for materials to help shape the Foundation's first PR story. I still remembered that day. She had said, "Dr. Joanna, your perspective is so humane. I'll just borrow a bit of inspiration." I didn't think she would copy every line. I didn't think she would turn my mother's memory into a tool to sell her own image to donors. The video ended with the words, "The Young Hearts Foundation, where compassion meets financial intelligence." Applause erupted. Some parents stood up, wiping away tears. They had no idea that the words that had just moved them came from a deceased nurse, an ordinary one, and she was my mother. I looked down at my hands, cold, bare. A sharp pain radiated from my left chest down my arm. It wasn't anger, it was grief. Some wounds aren't born from betrayal, but from the silent theft of things only you understand the value of. Maverick patted Jessica on the back as she returned to the table. They clinked glasses. I caught Jessica's quick glance toward me. No remorse, no hesitation. Just a thin smile. As if to say, "I did it, so what?" I left the table and walked toward the restroom. Not to cry, but to breathe. Because if I didn't remind myself to inhale, I would shatter. In the mirror, my reflection no longer showed the fatigue of long shifts, but the bruising of someone who had just lost a piece of their memory. But deep in my eyes, there was no longer just sadness. Something was moving. A part of me had stopped waiting for recognition and began wanting it back. When I returned to my seat, the party had shifted into the cocktail hour. No more blinding stage lights, just soft amber glows reflecting off crystal glasses and the quiet hum of jazz weaving between chairs. No one was paying attention to me anymore. That was fine. I didn't need their attention. I needed his, Charles. And he was watching me. No nod, no words, just one look, held for 2 seconds, long enough to confirm it was time. Charles pulled out his phone. His hands didn't shake. His movements were swift, clean, like someone who had been gathering files for months. A document was sent. Not through email, not via regular text. It was a secure app he once taught me to use when handling sensitive medical records. The screen simply read, "Sent. Encrypted. Delivered." I glanced around the room. No one noticed. They were still taking selfies in front of the Heart for Future backdrop, still raising glasses to Jessica's ascent, still laughing politely at investment stories that had nothing to do with the beat of any fragile heart out there. But at the center table, David Chen, the Foundation's board chairman, received a notification. He took out his phone, looked down to read. His face, usually composed like a mountain rock, subtly changed. Not overtly. But those who'd worked with him long enough would know. David never furrows his brow unless something is wrong. At that moment, Jessica stood nearby, speaking with a Korean investor, one who had pledged $5 million for the next funding round. David looked at her briefly, then turned away, removed his Bluetooth earpiece, whispered to his assistant, left the table, and walked backstage. The air shifted. No one could explain why. But it was the same feeling in an OR when the monitor flashes a single offbeat, and those with experience feel it in their bones. Lisa, still at table 12, leaned toward me and whispered, "Something's happening, isn't it?" I didn't answer. But I knew this was no longer a party. This was a chessboard. And my father had just moved the first piece. I took out my phone and opened the last photo in my library. A slide of the Foundation's operational plan I had proposed 6 months ago, detailing a community health model for underprivileged children. That file had never made it to the board. Maverick had excluded it from the meeting, citing misalignment with long-term financial strategy. But now David Chen was reading it, alongside Charles's full report. A dossier of stolen ideas, manipulated roles, and proof that Jessica lacked the medical expertise to lead a heart patient support fund. The party carried on, but it was the continuation of a ship whose course had quietly been changed. And as Maverick kept laughing with a donor from Austin, he didn't know. The shiny shell he built for himself was already beginning to crack from within. I stood up. No one had invited me to speak. There was no microphone for me, the woman who should have been the central figure in this 10-year wedding anniversary celebration. But if I stayed seated, the truth would be buried beneath satin tablecloths and foaming wine glasses. I walked toward the bar where Maverick was laughing with a group of guests, clinking glasses with Jessica. They didn't see me approaching. Or maybe they did, and pretended not to. "Maverick!" I called out, loud enough that no one could ignore. "I want to ask you something, right here, right now." He turned, surprised, annoyed. "We're entertaining guests." "Can't it wait until later?" "No," I said. "It can't wait. This is our 10-year wedding anniversary, and I've just learned that I am not listed in any of the operational plans for the foundation. The same foundation you once swore would be mine to lead." A ripple of whispers began to spread. Not loud, but enough to still the air. Jessica stepped in, inserting herself between us, her voice calm, programmed. "I'm sorry, Dr. Joanna. This is a community celebration. If there's been any misunderstanding, we can discuss it privately." "This isn't the place to personalize conflict," I laughed. Not a joyful laugh, but the kind that erupts when hearing something so fake, so absurd, it borders on comedy. "Community?" I repeated, locking eyes with her. "Jessica, this is my 10-year wedding anniversary. A party where I, the wife, wasn't on the VIP seating chart. My photo wasn't on the invitation. I wasn't allowed to speak, wasn't even mentioned. This isn't a community event. It's a PR campaign in disguise. And if you want to talk about personal conflict, then I'll say it. I feel betrayed. By the man I once trusted. And by a woman who once stood in my house, read my mother's notebook, and turned it into a script for your campaign." Jessica turned pale. She leaned toward Maverick and whispered something. Maverick, flustered, stepped in to defend her. "Joanna, you're overreacting. This isn't the time to make a scene." "Then when is the right time? When they hand Jessica her award? When I quietly leave the room like some unwanted guest?" A security staff member appeared, approaching quickly. "Ma'am, we've received a request to de-escalate a sensitive situation. If you cannot remain calm, we'll have to ask you to leave the main area." I didn't respond. I just looked toward the back of the room, where my father still stood, silent all evening, like an old man simply attending his daughter's celebration. Charles stepped forward, not quickly, but steadily, and for the first time, he spoke. "She doesn't need to leave. But those who should prepare to are the ones abusing the name of community to grab personal glory." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but it rang louder than any microphone. Maverick turned back. "Charles? Dad? What are you saying?" "I'm speaking of what you've hidden," he replied. No names, no raised tone. "And I'm here to make it clear." The room sank, like a rope suddenly slackened. No one knew who Charles was. To them, he was just the quiet father-in-law, calm, reserved, no LinkedIn profile, hadn't spoken a word all night. But now, he was the one person silencing an entire ballroom. Maverick looked lost. Jessica scanned the room for help, but no one stepped in, because everyone felt something had shifted, and it couldn't be undone with polite smiles or pre-written apologies. Charles stepped into the center of the ballroom. Laughter from the front tables vanished. No one spoke. No one knew who he was. And that, precisely, was what made them start to feel afraid. Afraid of what they'd ignored all night. That something about this event was off. "Maverick," Charles said, eyes locked on his son-in-law. "I'll say this only once. And you'd better listen closely." Maverick froze, still trying to appear composed, but clearly losing control. "Dad, this isn't the time." You're making people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Charles said softly. So you're fine hosting a party under the guise of a wedding anniversary, turning it into an investor gathering, erasing your wife's name from every list, and handing over foundation leadership to someone legally unqualified? Jessica jumped in, voice trembling. What are you saying? I was approved by the board. I have the financial capacity to manage. You may have the financial capacity, Charles cut her off, but you lack the medical qualifications. Per Clause 7.3 of the eligibility conditions for executive director outlined in the agreement between Health Tech Innovations and the Heart for Future organization, Charles pulled a printed document from his suit and held it up. I have the original signed contract, with legal signatures from the funders, the founders, and I am the final signatory. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. Maverick shook his head. No. No way. Charles, you're just the quiet father-in-law? Charles smirked. You never once asked why every funding round had a silent strategic partner injecting capital at the right moment? Did you ever ask who reviewed personnel qualifications for each grant from Health Tech? Jessica opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Charles placed the contract on the podium, the very one where Maverick had just praised her with embellished words minutes earlier. According to the contract, he enunciated, the executive director must have at least 7 years of experience in the medical field, hold valid U.S. medical credentials, and have direct clinical experience with pediatric cardiology patients. He turned to Jessica. Do you? Jessica stood frozen. No one could answer for her. She had never been a doctor, never stepped into an operating room, never stayed up all night for a child waiting on a heart valve. Charles continued, any appointment that violates this clause will result in immediate termination of all funding. Unconditionally, the murmurs rose again. Some began checking their phones, scrolling through cooperation emails, investment agreements. A few senior board members stood and began whispering among themselves. No one looked at Jessica with admiration anymore. Maverick turned to David Chen, the board chairman, desperate. David, what is this? I thought. We agreed. But David didn't answer. He was rereading the file on his phone, the one Charles had sent an hour ago. And from that moment on, everything Maverick and Jessica had built began to unravel. No arguments, no microphone needed. Just a contract. And the man they had always assumed was just the quiet old father-in-law not worth noticing. Maverick clenched his fists, veins bulging at his wrist. Jessica stepped back, face pale. Neither of them said a word, but I knew. They were scrambling for a story, a defense, a counterplay. Charles didn't give them that time. He turned toward the main screen at the center of the room, signaled to the technician. No words needed, just a nod. The screen flickered, and then the images appeared. The first photo showed Maverick and Jessica sitting together in the lobby of a boutique hotel in Napa Valley. Both in casual clothes, no name badges, Jessica's head resting on Maverick's shoulder. Far too intimate for any professional relationship. The next was in a small cafe in Chicago. Facing each other, their hands touching across the table, eyes locked. And finally, a hallway video clip from Hotel Indigo, where Jessica had booked a room using foundation funds. Maverick opened the door for her close to midnight. She kissed his cheek. They entered. The door closed. The murmurs in the room were no longer whispers. They were the groans of shattered trust. A few front-row donors stood up immediately. One older woman shook her head. God, that girl just yesterday asked me to sign a pledge for patient support. Joanna, that is, I, had no need to say anything. The evidence had spoken. Charles stepped forward amid the uproar, placing a hand on the microphone. His voice was deep and steady, like oak. I'm not speaking to defend my daughter. She's strong enough to stand on her own. I speak to remind everyone, do not confuse trust with strategy, and do not turn patients into PR tools. He turned to Maverick. You didn't just steal your wife's professional opportunity, you stole the honor of a doctor. And you betrayed the very values this foundation was built to uphold. Charles turned to David Chen. As the founder and primary donor to this foundation via Health Tech Innovations, I hereby withdraw the entire $50 million funding commitment, effective immediately. The air cracked. Jessica gasped, stepped forward. You can't do that. We planned that funding for 3 satellite hospitals. The media's already announced. Good, Charles replied bluntly. Then you'd better prepare new media releases. Starting this week, he took out his phone and pressed a button. And on the screen, a new logo appeared. The Joanna Chikwa Heart Renewal Foundation, with a small tagline beneath, led by doctors, built for children. The young doctors at table 12 stood up, applauding first. Some nurses joined in. Parents, who had been quiet at the back, now rose. The applause rippled like a tidal wave, swallowing what was left of the event. Jessica refused to retreat. In the moment, she should have stepped back, stayed silent, and disappeared quietly from the ballroom. She instead walked up to the microphone, straightened the sleeves of her blazer, and spoke as though everything that had happened was one big misunderstanding. I'd like to say a few words, she began, her voice trembling, but holding on to a practiced professionalism. I acknowledge there were missteps in how I represented my relationship with Dr. Maverick, and I apologize for any disappointment caused. But I must emphasize that over the past 2 years, I have devoted all of my financial expertise and investment network to building this foundation. No one can deny that thanks to those contributions, more than 1,000 children received early-stage support. A few shuffles were heard in the back of the room. Some guests sat back down. Some folded their arms. Jessica continued, her eyes now scanning the remaining donors. If we allow emotions to override reason, we risk losing the opportunity to continue the meaningful work we've begun. I hope the board can evaluate everything fairly, based on outcomes, not personal mistakes. Charles let her finish, giving her the space to deliver her final monologue of self-assurance. Then, stepping up to the podium once more, he said calmly, Jessica, you're not wrong to highlight financial efficiency. But where you and Maverick are wrong is in your definition of good. He paused. If a medical foundation is built on PR, venture capital, and image control, but lacks the voice of patients, the hands of skilled doctors, and an actual heart, then it ceases to be a medical foundation. Worse, when financial efficiency is used to mask appropriation, it falls beneath even the minimum threshold of ethics. From his jacket, Charles pulled another printed sheet and held it aloft. This is a record of a $1.2 million expense filed under purchase of medical supplies for free heart surgeries. In reality, the entire amount was transferred to an entity called Bluewell Logistics, registered under Jessica's cousin, incorporated just 3 weeks before the wire was approved. This company has no license to distribute medical devices and has never delivered any goods to the hospitals listed in the report. He placed the paper on David Chen's table. The evidence is here. And honor. That's what now sits on the scales. Facing the room, he continued, that is why I'm launching a new platform. Not to punish, but to restore what has been distorted. Behind him, the screen displayed once again the Joanna Chikwa Heart Renewal Foundation, followed by the words, medical integrity, child-centered care, community-first model. This foundation, Charles said, will be led by those who operate daily in ORS, in ICUS, and in underfunded clinics. We will not host galas. We will not spend on inflated media campaigns. Every dollar received will go straight into the hands of hospitals and families who need it most. A second wave of applause rose, quieter but resolute. A middle-aged doctor stood and declared, if there's space for someone from a community clinic, I volunteer. A nurse added, I worked with Dr. Joanna last year. She never turned away a single child, even the ones without insurance. Jessica was still standing, But no one saw her as the center anymore. She was simply a well-dressed woman, surrounded by real stories from real people. Charles closed with finality. We don't sell hope, and we certainly don't sell trust. We rebuild it, one surgery at a time, one heart at a time. And in that moment, I knew. What I thought was lost had come back. Not fame, but meaning. Charles hadn't yet stepped down when the screen behind him changed. No more logos, no more foundation slogans. A 1-minute video began. No effects, no stylization. Just a little boy with curly hair, sitting in a hospital room, wide-eyed, his arm wrapped in bandages, and a slow, heartfelt voice. My name is Dylan. Last year, I couldn't breathe. My mom cried, and the doctor said I needed heart surgery, but we didn't have any money. Then a doctor named Joanna helped me. Now I can run, I can play soccer, and my mom says, that doctor is the one who keeps my heart strong. The video cut to Dylan holding a soccer ball, running under the sun, turning back to wave. No music, no narration, just a closing line, one of 127 patients saved by Dr. Joanna Chiqua. No one clapped, no one needed to. The silence in that room wasn't awkward or heavy. It was the silence of people waking up. I saw one donor remove their guest badge. A woman stood, walked to my table, and said gently, "You once gave my son 3 free consultations." I didn't know. I'm so sorry, I nodded, saying nothing, because what I needed wasn't an apology, it was change. Charles picked up the mic for the last time, his tone softened but firm. This is my final word tonight. Not to close a party, but to close an era of falsehood. He turned to David Chen and handed him an official statement. I request immediate termination of all funding commitments to the foundation represented by Maverick Chiqua, including all expanded grants and contingency funds. I also request a full freeze of all financial operations linked to contracts signed in the past 3 months. Pending independent audit, Jessica turned pale. Maverick stepped back, ready to protest, but David Chen spoke simply. Acknowledged. Effective immediately, and with that, everything shifted. The same people who had once turned away now approached. The hands that had struck me off lists now extended offers of collaboration. But I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt that the world had finally righted itself. Charles stepped down and came toward me. He said nothing, but in his eyes, I saw the one thing I had waited my whole life for. You were right not to stay silent. I took his hand. 3 days after the event, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. A major New York newspaper offered me the cover of their Women of Resilience issue. A California network invited me to a talk show titled Women Who Rise After Betrayal. A publishing house wanted to co-author a memoir. Even those who once dismissed me, now eagerly, wanted to be seen as professional allies. I turned off my phone, removed the SIM card, then sent Charles a short email with 3 lines. I won't go on talk shows. I won't do interviews. I want to start where I belong, the operating room. And I hope the foundation works as we promised. His reply was just one sentence. Proud of you. I didn't return to the hospital through the main entrance. I came in through the back, where nurses pass each day. No welcome signs, no flowers, no new nameplate. Just the echo of my shoes down white-tiled halls and the familiar scent of antiseptic. In the locker room, I changed into my old scrubs. The green ones, worn thin at the shoulders, but molded to every fold of me. Looking into the mirror, I didn't see a victim or a hero. I saw a surgeon. A woman whose hands were still steady enough to cradle a tiny heart losing its rhythm. And that was enough. That afternoon, I performed the first surgery under the new foundation name. Joanna Chiqua Heart Renewal. A 6-year-old girl from the Arizona border. Her mother had enclosed a handwritten note. Dr. Joanna, we have nothing but our gratitude and our daughter's eyes. If after the surgery she can still see the sky, it's because of you. I folded the letter and tucked it into my chest pocket. No cameras, no hashtags, no one watching. Just one successful operation, one steady heartbeat, one child with a chance to live. That night, when I got home, Charles was waiting at the door with a brown paper bag. He didn't say much, just placed it on the table and said, "Dinner." And a few things you'll need inside was a simple meal, and my mother's notebook, worn, old, but intact. No more quotes ripped from their meaning. I held it to my chest, and for the first time in months, I cried. Because now I knew, no matter how much the world might try to strip me of stages, spotlights, or titles, there are things, like love, memory, and integrity, that no one can ever touch. 1 month after I returned to the operating room, a small bronze plaque was installed on the wall in front of the hospital's main lobby. It wasn't extravagant. No gilded frame. Just one simple line engraved neatly. Place ethics above efficiency. Place patience above self. O.H. H. I never requested the plaque. It was proposed by the nurses and clinical staff themselves. They said, not to honor anyone, but to remind each other someone once chose to stay. After that, letters began arriving, not from the press or media, but from doctors in remote towns. An OB/GYN in Montana wrote that her OR lost funding after the pandemic and now needs a portable fetal heart monitor. A head nurse in El Paso, Texas sent a photo of their crowded emergency room, still managing to treat undocumented newborns. A medical student from an indigenous community in New Mexico asked for a scholarship to pursue pediatric surgery. We couldn't help everyone, but we began with the smallest things. In the first week, the foundation funded 8 monitors. By the second, we awarded scholarships to 3 med students from underrepresented backgrounds. In the third, we launched a post-op mental health program for parents, something most hospitals never thought of. No one received cash. No one had access to unrestricted funds. Every dollar passed through 3 layers of verification and a professional committee of doctors and nurses. No spokespersons, no ceremonies. One day, I was invited to a small gathering in the side hall of St. Clair Hospital, where I had once performed a rare heart rotation surgery on a little girl 3 years earlier. When I arrived, I saw her, now 9 years old, holding a hand-drawn sign. Dr. Joanna, my heart beats every day. Because of you, I knelt down. I couldn't speak. She hugged me, gently, as if afraid I might break. That night, I didn't go home right away. I went to our foundation office, a small temporary space in the local health district. On my desk was an unsigned file, the proposal for our first mobile surgical program starting in Louisiana. Charles had left a handwritten note on top. It's time to plant again. I picked up the pen and signed. But this time, there was no hesitation, because I knew every word I wrote was to protect something truly worth preserving. One afternoon in April, I received an email from a familiar address, Westbridge Memorial Hospital. The subject line read, "Invitation for Advisory Collaboration, New Heart Care Fund Development Program." I read it several times, not because I didn't understand, but because I wasn't sure they knew who they were inviting. This was the hospital Maverick used to run, the place where I was once the nominal medical lead, but excluded from every strategic decision, where I presented a plan for a congenital heart support fund and was told it was too unrealistic, where Jessica was once seen as the future and I was the past they hoped to erase. The email came from the new director, not Maverick. He wrote, "After what happened, we've realized certain essential values were lost. We're not looking for an advisor to fix our image. We're looking for someone who puts patience above spreadsheets. I took a day to think. Not because of lingering emotion, but because I needed to be sure I was walking through that door with an open heart." The next morning, I arrived. No prior notice, no entourage, just my white coat, hair tied back, neat and simple. When I entered the main lobby, a young nurse looked up, then stood quickly. "Dr. Joanna?" I nodded. She stared for a moment, almost in disbelief. I I was a senior med student when you were here. I remember the complex heart transplant you led. Back then, you were pulled from the project and no one dared speak up. I smiled gently. So, do you still want to be a doctor? She nodded, nearly teary-eyed. Yes, and I haven't forgotten why I started. I walked into the boardroom. Maverick wasn't there. Just the new leadership team. People who owed me no apology, but chose to show up through action. They asked if I'd be willing to advise their frontline doctor training program. I replied, yes. But only if everyone understands. Titles don't save lives. Hands do. No one objected. No one corrected. And I realized this wasn't an invitation to return. It was an affirmation. I had stepped forward. I no longer needed to look back. That afternoon, before leaving, I paused in an old hallway where Jessica's press releases once lined the walls using my words. Now the walls were bare, but I didn't feel loss. I felt space. On the way home, I stopped at a second-hand bookstore near the community health center. There, I found a thin booklet labeled, First Writing Book for Children Facing Heart Surgery. Based on real patient experience, I opened the first page. The dedication read, For Dr. Joanna, who taught me that a hurting heart can still write kindness. Author, Dylan, the boy from the video. I sat down, read it cover to cover. 1 year after its founding, the Joanna Chikwa Heart Renewal Foundation had funded 127 pediatric heart surgeries across the U.S. 89 families received housing and travel support during treatment. Over 200 post-op patients received mental health care through our Heart Talks program, run by volunteer young physicians. But numbers weren't what stayed with me. I remembered the eyes of a boy named Thomas in Mississippi, once denied treatment for lacking insurance. He now raced his older brother every morning. I remembered a young mother who bowed outside the OR and whispered to me, You don't need to save my child with a miracle. Just save him with everything you know. And I remembered one rainy evening, walking out of the hospital, passing a group of med students reciting the Hippocratic Oath under the eaves. Not recording, not live streaming. Some things truly survive, even in a world that markets everything. I started rewriting my mother's notebook, not to publish, not to sell, but to preserve what I had added after years inside operating rooms, facing life, death, and all the unnamed things in between. Injustice, forgiveness, and choice. One morning in June, I was invited to speak at the medical school commencement at Riverside University. I declined, but I sent a handwritten letter, read aloud by a faculty member. If one day you feel like just an ordinary doctor, remember, there are thousands of heartbeats out there counting on that very ordinariness to survive. I still perform surgeries. Not as often as before, but enough to keep my soul awake. I also returned to painting, a passion I had abandoned in med school. And I planted flowers on my porch. Lavender and white daisies, blooming in small clusters, not flamboyant, but patient. One evening, Charles came to visit. He no longer talked about grants, or board seats, or budgets. We simply sat in silence, until he asked, Do you still feel like something was taken from you? I looked at the garden. The young plants were rooting. No, I said, because in the end, I no longer need anyone to know what I built. I just need to know I never disappeared. If you are a mother, a grandmother, or a woman who has ever been overlooked in your own home, I hope this story touched a corner of your heart. You may never have stood on a stage. You may have stayed silent to keep the peace. But please remember, your gentleness has never been weakness, and your voice has never been too late to be heard. If you see yourself in this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with another woman, one who also deserves to be named. And if you're willing, leave me a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. We'll meet again. Thank you for staying until the end.